So that was a really good one. Oh my God. So let me see if I can put this into words. You claim to have evidence for a position. In order for me to accept your evidence as valid, you must first prove another proposition, which is necessary but not sufficient for the original one. If you can prove the subsidiary proposition, then I will grant that there is some evidence for your original position. But by itself, it does not constitute evidence for your original position. That's right. Hey there, welcome to my channel. I'm here. I think you're gonna like this video if you watch until the end, because I've got a couple of tips on how to craft arguments in such a way that nobody can ever refute them again. And they'll be so simple that it's almost laughable that more people don't think of them. They are so obvious, but I think you're gonna like them. So stick around. Okay, so before I get to the joke and the argumentative technique, I want to tell you about something that I am super excited about. It's a website that gives you real-time feedback on your written English. It can check your spelling, grammar, style, tone, word choice, clarity, and more. There is no better way to improve your writing than getting detailed feedback on your work. However, asking a teacher or a friend to do that is just unreasonable. But now, thanks to technology, it's possible. And that's why I am super excited to tell you about a platform. Grammarly is an AI-driven platform that makes writing easier for everyone. Its real-time feedback feature lets you know what to add, remove, or change while you write. Grammarly helps you save time and deliver your best work wherever words matter most. Let's say you're writing an essay for school. First, you can install the free browser extension to access Grammarly's Writing Assistant. When you go to submit your work, Grammarly's free writing assistant will immediately scan your text for any potential issues. Then it provides suggestions to help you make your writing clear, mistake-free, and engaging. With Grammarly Premium, you can take your writing to the next level. You'll get advanced suggestions to improve your vocabulary, tone, and style. For example, its vocabulary enhancement feature suggests words with just the right nuance for your writing. You can also tailor your writing style to suit your audience. Let's say you need to write a professional email. In addition to spelling and grammar, Grammarly will make sure your tone is appropriate. Finally, Grammarly helps you avoid unintentional bias in your writing. Grammarly Premium picks up on gendered, racial, and other potentially biased language, helping you choose words that are both precise and inclusive. Again, that's a feature that can save you from unintentional bias. Now, back to the show. Okay, so I used to talk to this guy who always came to our debates prepared. He had rebuttals ready for all of the points that I made, and he even anticipated the counterpoints that I would make to his rebuttals. It was quite annoying, actually. So during one of the debates, I said to him, "I'd agree with you, but then we'd both be wrong." He didn't understand what I meant at first, but then he thought about it and realized that I was correct. This happens when someone has evidence for a subsidiary proposition, but uses it as evidence for a conclusion that is not logically connected to that subsidiary proposition. For example, someone might say, "God exists because I feel His presence every day in my life." The conclusion is that God exists. The subsidiary proposition is that the person feels God's presence every day in their life. Now, assuming that the person isn't delusional, there is likely some evidence for the subsidiary proposition. Perhaps lots of other people report feeling God's presence too, and the person has reason to think that they aren't just making it up. So let's grant that there is evidence for the subsidiary proposition. But just because someone feels a spiritual presence doesn't entail that God exists. Feeling God's presence could be evidence for a belief in God, but by itself, it does not constitute evidence for the existence of God. Another example, someone might say, "God exists because the Bible says that He does." The conclusion is that God exists. The subsidiary proposition is that the Bible says that God exists. Assuming that the person isn't just making things up, there is likely some evidence for the subsidiary proposition. Lots of people report reading the Bible and concluding that God exists. So let's grant that there is evidence for the subsidiary proposition. But just because the Bible says that God exists doesn't entail that God exists. The Bible's claim that God exists could be evidence for a belief in God. But by itself, it does not constitute evidence for the existence of God. Someone might say, you shouldn't trust Gary because he's a convicted felon. The conclusion is that you shouldn't trust Gary. The subsidiary proposition is that Gary is a convicted felon. There is likely evidence for the subsidiary proposition. Maybe Gary is actually a convicted felon. If there is evidence for the subsidiary proposition, then I will grant that there is some evidence for the conclusion that you shouldn't trust Gary, but by itself, it does not constitute evidence for that conclusion. Being a convicted felon could be evidence for a conclusion about whether or not you should trust Gary, but by itself, it does not constitute evidence for that conclusion. Someone might say, you shouldn't trust Sue because she lied to you in the past. The conclusion is that you shouldn't trust Sue. The subsidiary proposition is that Sue lied to you in the past. There is likely evidence for the subsidiary proposition, perhaps lots of times. So let's grant that there is evidence for the subsidiary proposition. But just because Sue lied to you in the past doesn't entail that you shouldn't trust her now. Sue's having lied to you in the past could be evidence for a conclusion about whether or not you should trust her. But by itself, it does not constitute evidence for that conclusion. And someone might say, you shouldn't trust Ted because he's an ex-felon. The conclusion is that you shouldn't trust Ted. The subsidiary proposition is that Ted is an ex-felon. There is likely evidence for the subsidiary proposition. Perhaps Ted actually did commit felonies in the past. So let's grant that there is evidence for the subsidiary proposition. But just because Ted committed felonies in the past doesn't entail that you shouldn't trust him now. Ted, being an ex-felon, could be evidence for a conclusion about whether or not you should trust him, but by itself, it does not constitute evidence for that conclusion. All right, now I promised I would tell you how to make an unrefutable argument, and I'm going to do that now, but only after I tell you that I don't really believe this argument technique is very useful because if the other person is smart, they'll simply shift the burden back onto you, and then you'll have to use it again, and it can get pretty tedious. So it's kind of like a party trick. Anyway, here's how it works. After the other person presents their evidence, say, okay, granted that you have evidence for that. Now what follows from that? They'll probably say, well, obviously this follows from that. And you say, no, it doesn't. Explain how it follows. And they'll have to either explain how it does follow or admit that it doesn't. And if they have to admit that it doesn't, then you win. But again, if they're smart, they'll just realize, oh, I have to connect the dots and I didn't do that yet. No problem. So then they'll do it, and then you'll have to do the trick again. But still, it's a pretty cool trick. Here's another example. Someone says, you shouldn't trust Janice because she drinks too much. The conclusion is that you shouldn't trust Janice. The subsidiary proposition is that Janice drinks too much. There is likely evidence for the subsidiary proposition. So let's grant that there is evidence for the subsidiary proposition. But just because Janice drinks too much doesn't entail that you shouldn't trust her. Janice drinking too much could be evidence for a conclusion about whether or not you should trust her. But by itself, it does not constitute evidence for that conclusion. So you say, okay, granted that she drinks too much, what follows from that? And they'll have to either explain how it follows or admit that it doesn't. All right, now if you want to master the art of debating and learn how to argue better, I recommend that you check out a course called The Art of Arguing. It's on a learning platform. Now, I've never taken the course myself, but I've seen the curriculum, and I think it's really good. It's based on the work of a guy named Anthony Weston, who I consider to be one of the best argumentation teachers out there. I've read his book, which is excellent, and I think that his course will teach you everything you need to know about how to argue well. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, please leave a like. Thanks for watching.